The evening sky was painted in warm hues of orange and pink, signaling the end of another day in the city. Inside a luxurious mansion, a well-dressed man named Richard sat at his grand desk, staring at a contract in front of him. His mind wandered as he ran his fingers over the edges of the paper, glancing occasionally out of the large windows at the sprawling garden below. Richard was a man of wealth and status, someone who had everything a person could want, except for something he had long since lost: excitement. It had been months since Richard felt challenged, and that was a feeling he couldn't bear. He was always surrounded by people who admired him, envied him, and sought his approval. He had all the money he could ever need, but he felt as if life was slipping through his fingers, dull and uneventful. Richard needed something to shake things up, something to put him at the center of attention again. And that's when he overheard a conversation at one of the parties he hosted. Two of his friends, Harry and Vince, were discussing an idea they had for a bet. Harry, with a mischievous grin, suggested that it would be interesting to see if Richard could marry someone who was completely unlike the type of women he usually surrounded himself with. Someone so different, it would be the talk of the town. They were suggesting, of course, that Richard marry someone who would be considered the opposite of the glamorous women he often dated, a woman they joked about being an ugly black beggar, just to stir things up. At first, Richard laughed off the idea. It seemed absurd, yet part of him found it strangely appealing. He wasn't afraid of scandal or controversy. In fact, it might give him the thrill he had been craving. After a little more back and forth, the bet was set. If Richard could marry this woman and go through with it, he would win a substantial sum of money from his friends. If he couldn't, then he would have to give up a percentage of his fortune. It seemed like a harmless challenge, a way to bring some excitement into his life. Determined to take on the challenge, Richard set out to find this woman who would break all the expectations. He searched the streets for someone who matched the description they had joked about. A woman of humble means, someone society would consider out of place in his world of wealth and luxury. To his surprise, he found her in a small, run-down part of the city, sitting on the steps of an old building with a weathered coat wrapped around her thin frame. Her name was Leila. She had a face that looked as if it had been shaped by hardships, with deep eyes that seemed to carry the weight of the world. Richard approached her, feeling a mix of curiosity and excitement. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a kind of quiet strength, and for the first time in a long while, Richard felt something stir inside him. She wasn't what he expected. She was more than just the sum of her appearances. She was a person with a story, a history, a life far beyond what anyone would assume by looking at her. Richard didn't tell her about the bet at first. Instead, he offered her a chance, a life she never dreamed of, a way out of the struggles she had been enduring for so long. Leila hesitated, unsure of what to make of this rich, well-dressed man offering her something she could never have imagined. But like Richard, she had her own reasons for saying yes. What began as a seemingly absurd wager turned into something more. Leila agreed to marry Richard, and a few weeks later, they stood in front of an audience of friends, family, and strangers, ready to exchange vows. But the real test would come on their wedding night. As the night unfolded, Richard expected the usual excitement, the thrill of having conquered something difficult. But as the hours passed, and the two of them sat alone in their lavish bedroom, Leila began to reveal a shocking secret that would forever change Richard's perception of her and of himself. The wedding day arrived in a flurry of activity, and Richard couldn't help but feel a strange mixture of excitement and nerves. The grand hall was decorated with sparkling chandeliers, and the guests, dressed in their finest clothes, chatted in hushed tones, awaiting the ceremony to begin. Richard had been planning this moment for weeks, and while the wedding was far from his usual taste, he found himself curious about how it would all unfold. Leila, on the other hand, had never imagined herself in such a setting. She had lived most of her life on the streets, struggling to get by, and now, here she was, about to marry a man she barely knew. She wasn't sure what to feel, surprised, confused, or maybe even a little terrified. The thought of marrying someone like Richard was almost too much to wrap her head around. She had spent so many years surviving day by day that the concept of a grand wedding and all its trappings seemed like something out of a dream. As she stood in front of a mirror, preparing for the ceremony, Layla saw a version of herself she had never seen before. Her hair was styled, her face was clean, and she wore an elegant dress that made her look almost like a different person. But despite the beauty of the moment, she didn't feel like herself. She still felt the weight of her past, the struggles, the hardships that had shaped who she was. The dress, the makeup, the luxurious surroundings, they didn't change the person inside. Richard, in his sharp tuxedo, walked to the front with a confident stride, trying to push away the sense of unease that lingered in the back of his mind. He had grown used to being in control of every situation, but this wedding felt different. There was something about Layla that made him question everything he thought he knew. She wasn't just the ugly beggar his friends had joked about. There was a quiet strength in her, a dignity that made Richard start to second-guess the reasons behind his initial decision. The ceremony itself was a blur for both of them. The vows they exchanged were short, formal, and felt more like a formality than an emotional commitment. Richard couldn't stop glancing at Layla during the ceremony, noticing the way she carried herself with a certain grace despite her past. He hadn't expected that. He had expected her to be nervous, unsure, but instead, she seemed calm, collected, as though she was embracing the situation in her own way. It was almost as if she was playing a part, but not in the way he thought. When the ceremony ended, the applause felt distant, like it was happening to someone else. Layla's hand was now officially linked with Richard's, and for a brief moment, he wondered if this was the right thing to do. But then the night continued, and everything moved forward as it always did. The reception was lavish, with food and drinks flowing, music filling the air, and people congratulating the newlyweds. But Layla felt out of place. As she stood next to Richard, she couldn't help but notice the stares, the whispers, the way people looked at her as if she didn't belong. It was as if she was an outsider in a world that wasn't hers. Richard, however, was too caught up in his own thoughts to notice. His mind wandered back to the bed, and he reminded himself that he was doing this for fun, for the challenge. He had no real attachment to Layla. At least, that's what he told himself. But there was a small part of him, a part he couldn't quite understand, that wondered if he had made a mistake. As the night wore on, the guests began to disperse, and the two of them found themselves alone in a lavish bedroom that felt too big for the both of them. Richard could feel the tension in the air, an unspoken question hanging between them. He didn't know what to expect from this night. Was it just another part of the game, or was there something more to Layla than he had realized? And Layla, sitting quietly across from him, was deep in thought as well. She had agreed to this marriage out of desperation, but now, faced with the reality of it, she wondered what it all meant. Why had Richard chosen her? Why had he asked her, of all people, to be his bride? She had her own doubts, her own questions, but one thing was clear. This night was about to reveal more than either of them could have anticipated. The evening had settled into a calm quietness, but the atmosphere in the room was anything but calm. Layla sat on the edge of the grand bed, her fingers nervously playing with the edge of her dress. Richard, standing near the window, looked out at the night sky, his thoughts a jumble of confusion. The day had gone as planned, a flawless wedding ceremony and a reception full of guests who admired him. But now, in the privacy of their room, he couldn't shake the strange feeling that had been growing inside him all day. As he turned to face Layla, he couldn't help but notice how different she seemed in the quiet of the room. The woman he had married was not the person he had imagined. Sure, she had the rough exterior of a beggar, but there was something more to her, something beyond the tattered clothes and worn-out shoes. There was a depth in her eyes, a quiet strength in the way she held herself that made him question everything about his plan. Layla, for her part, had never felt more out of place. The room was far too grand, the bed far too large for just one person, and the silence felt heavier than it ever had before. She was used to the sounds of the street, the chatter of people, the rustling of leaves, the distant hum of traffic. But here, in this enormous mansion, everything seemed muted, as if even the air was holding its breath. The unfamiliarity of it all made her feel like she didn't belong, even though she had stepped into this world of luxury for the sake of survival. Despite everything, Leela felt the weight of Richard's gaze on her. He hadn't said much to her since the ceremony, but she could tell that he was watching her, waiting for her to make the next move. But what was the next move? Was this supposed to be just another part of the game for him? She didn't know. All she knew was that she had agreed to this marriage, but it was still hard for her to believe it was real. Richard finally broke the silence. His voice was softer than it had been all day, almost as if he were unsure of himself. "Leela," he said, stepping closer, "I never expected any of this." Leela turned to him, her brow furrowed slightly. She didn't understand what he meant. What was he talking about? She had her own questions, but she didn't know how to ask them. Richard continued, his voice now tinged with an emotion Leela couldn't quite place. "I mean, you're different. I thought this would be easy, you know. A joke. But now, I don't know." He paused, looking down at his feet. "You're not what I expected." Leela sat up straighter, the confusion evident in her eyes. "And what did you expect?" she asked softly, though she could feel her heart racing. She wasn't sure if she wanted to hear his answer, but something inside of her pushed her to ask. Richard hesitated for a moment before answering. "I expected someone to be desperate, someone who would do anything for money, for a way out of their life. But you're not like that." He shook his head, his gaze shifting from her face to the floor. "You're strong. You've been through things, haven't you?" Leela's heart skipped a beat. It was the first time anyone had ever spoken to her like that, with such understanding. She wasn't just the beggar Richard thought she was. She was a person with a past, a history, and it seemed like for the first time, someone was seeing that. She took a deep breath and spoke, her voice steady but low. "I've had my struggles, but it doesn't mean I want to be pitied, Richard." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with quiet resolve. "I didn't agree to this for your money. I agreed because I wanted to see what it felt like to live differently, to experience something I never thought was possible. But that doesn't mean I'm here for you to look down on." Richard was taken aback by her words. He had expected to be the one in control, but now, in front of Leela, he was the one feeling uncertain. He hadn't realized how much of his own arrogance had been clouding his judgment. He had thought he could manipulate the situation, but Leela wasn't someone who could be manipulated. She wasn't desperate. She was here on her own terms. He stepped back, his mind racing. For the first time in a long while, he felt challenged, not by some external obstacle, but by the woman sitting in front of him. She was more than a vet. She was someone who had lived a life full of hardship, someone who had endured things he couldn't even begin to imagine. And yet she wasn't broken. She wasn't begging for his pity. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence in the room was thick, but it was different now. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with a kind of mutual understanding. Richard realized that the game he had started wasn't a game at all anymore. And Leela, sitting across from him, realized that maybe she wasn't the only one who had a lot to learn. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly, and neither Richard nor Leela knew quite what to make of the quiet that had settled between them. The lavish bedroom, with its thick curtains and soft, golden lighting, felt distant and unfamiliar to both of them now. Richard couldn't help but glance at Leela every few moments, still unable to fully understand what had just happened. Her words had stayed with him, and the way she spoke, calm, collected, not at all what he had expected, made him question everything about the plan he had set in motion. Leela, on the other hand, felt a strange sense of unease that had nothing to do with the bed or the wedding itself. She had agreed to marry Richard, but as the hours passed, she couldn't ignore the lingering feeling that something was off. This was supposed to be a simple arrangement, a way for her to escape the harshness of the streets. But now, after the ceremony, after the shared words with Richard, she was beginning to feel the weight of the promise she had made to herself. Richard was still standing by the window, staring out at the dark night. He looked lost in thought, almost as if he were searching for something that wasn't there. Leila hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether to speak or remain silent. But then, a soft voice broke the stillness. "You really didn't expect this, did you?" Leila's words were gentle, but they held a quiet strength that Richard couldn't ignore. He turned to face her, startled for a moment, and then nodded slowly. "No," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "I thought it would be different. I didn't think it would feel real." He let out a deep sigh and took a step toward her, his gaze softening. "You're not what I thought you were, Leila." Leila didn't answer immediately. She had heard words like that before, from people who judged her based on her appearance, her past, and what they thought they knew. But Richard's words felt different. They weren't filled with pity or disdain, but with a sense of wonder, as though he was trying to make sense of something he couldn't quite grasp. That in itself was strange. "I'm not what you thought," she replied quietly. "But that doesn't mean I'm not real." Richard took another step closer, this time sitting down on the edge of the bed next to her. His eyes softened as he looked at her. He didn't know what it was about Leila that made him want to listen so intently. Maybe it was her honesty. Maybe it was the way she didn't beg for anything, not even for his sympathy. Whatever it was, he felt something he hadn't expected to feel, a kind of respect. "You're right," Richard said, his voice quieter now. "I've spent so much of my life judging people based on their status, their looks, and everything else. I never really stopped to wonder who they were or why they ended up where they did. And now, with you, it's like I'm seeing things in a completely different light." Leila looked at him, not with pity or judgment, but with something much more genuine, understanding. She had learned long ago that people often saw what they wanted to see, whether it was the desperate beggar she had been or the polished millionaire she was now married to. But what mattered most was who she really was on the inside, and that was something she couldn't change, no matter how hard she tried. "It's not just about looks or wealth, Richard," Leila said, her voice steady and firm. "It's about understanding. People are complex. They're not just what they appear to be." Richard nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I can see that now," he said softly. "You've been through so much more than I could ever imagine, and here I was, treating this like some kind of game. I didn't even think about what you might be going through, what it took for you to get here." Leila gave him a small, almost wistful smile. "Everyone has their story," she said. "Mine just looks different from most people's. But it's mine, and it's what's made me who I am." For a moment, there was silence again, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. Richard sat beside her, processing her words. Leila's calmness, her resilience, her quiet strength, everything about her made him rethink his own life, his own choices. She wasn't just a bet he had won. She was a person, someone with her own dreams, her own history, and her own future. Finally, Richard broke the silence, his voice softer than before. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I shouldn't have treated you like a bet, like a challenge. You deserve more than that." Leila nodded, her gaze steady. "It's not too late to change, Richard. We both have the chance to start over." For the first time that night, Richard smiled. It was small, but it was genuine. He didn't know where this strange new path would lead them, but for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. There was something real between them now, something deeper than a bet, something neither of them had expected. The hours passed in the quiet of their bedroom, with both Richard and Leila still processing the unexpected emotions swirling between them. The wedding night had been nothing like Richard had imagined, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Leila than just the woman he had chosen as part of a bet. As they sat together, The silence felt less heavy now, almost peaceful, as if they had both come to a mutual understanding without speaking much at all. Leela, however, was still wrestling with her own thoughts. She had kept so much of her past hidden, not because she was ashamed, but because she never thought anyone would care to listen. She had always kept her life a mystery to others, but tonight felt different. There was something about Richard's curiosity, his honesty, that made her wonder if she could finally open up and share the truth. Finally, Leela spoke, her voice calm but serious. "There's something I need to tell you, Richard." Richard turned to face her, his expression filled with interest. He had been waiting for her to speak, but he hadn't known exactly what to expect. Whatever it was, he was ready to listen. Leela took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "I haven't always been a beggar," she said slowly. "In fact, I used to have everything. Money, a family, a home. But everything changed one day." Richard was taken aback. He had never asked about Leela's past, but hearing her say that she once had a different life made him realize just how little he knew about her. Leela continued, her eyes distant as she recalled the memories. "My father was a wealthy businessman. He had everything anyone could want, but he wasn't a good man. He made enemies, and those enemies made sure that everything we had was taken from us. The house, the money, everything, gone in an instant." Richard listened intently, unsure of what to say. He hadn't expected such a tragic story. To him, Leela had always been the poor beggar he found on the street, someone who lived with nothing. But the reality was far more complicated. Leela went on, her voice quiet but strong. "I didn't want to be a part of that world anymore. The world of power and wealth. What good was it if it could be taken away in a second? So I left. I chose to live on the streets. It wasn't easy, but it felt like the only way to be free." Richard felt a pang of guilt as he listened to her story. The woman sitting in front of him wasn't just some pawn in his game. She was someone who had lost everything, yet had somehow found the strength to rebuild her life from scratch. He had been so focused on winning a bet, so wrapped up in the idea of controlling everything, that he had never once stopped to consider the deeper layers of who Leela was. Leela turned to him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of understanding. "I'm not here because I want your money or your pity, Richard. I'm here because I thought this would be a way to start fresh. But now, I see that maybe we both need a fresh start." Richard was quiet for a moment, his mind racing with the new information. He had never considered the pain Leela had endured. Her strength, her decision to leave everything behind, made him see her in a completely new light. She wasn't just a woman he had married out of a dare. She was someone who had lived through hardship and had chosen her own path, no matter how difficult it had been. "I'm sorry, Leela," Richard said softly, his voice full of sincerity. "I had no idea. I judged you without knowing anything about your past, and that was wrong. I never thought for a second that you had a story like that." Leela smiled faintly, the first real smile Richard had seen from her since the wedding. "It's okay. I didn't expect you to understand, but now you do, and that means something." Richard leaned back against the headboard of the bed, his mind still processing everything. Lila's story had changed his perspective completely. What he had thought was a simple bet had turned into something far more complicated, far more meaningful. He had been so focused on winning that he hadn't taken the time to truly understand the person he was dealing with, and now he was beginning to realize that he had much more to learn. For the first time that night, Richard felt a sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about both of them, about the lives they had led and the paths they were now on together. The idea of their marriage no longer felt like a game. It felt like an opportunity for both of them to start fresh, to build something new based on respect, honesty, and understanding. Leela, seeing the change in him, felt a small sense of hope begin to rise within her. Maybe this marriage, which had started as a foolish wager, could become something more, something real. And maybe, just maybe, they could both learn from each other and grow in ways they hadn't expected. The night passed in quiet contemplation, and the following days were filled with a mix of uncertainty and curiosity. Richard couldn't shake the feeling that everything had shifted. What had started as a simple bet, something he had expected to be a brief amusement, was now a complicated and unfamiliar situation. He found himself thinking about Leela more than he had intended. Her story, her strength, the way she had calmly explained her past. Everything about her was different from what he had imagined. For years, Richard had lived in a world where everything was about appearances, about what you had, what you owned, and who you knew. It was a world of luxury, where success was measured by the size of your bank account or the exclusivity of your friends. But now, sitting in his massive mansion, surrounded by wealth, he felt more lost than ever before. Leela had opened his eyes to something he had never considered: the value of experiences, of personal history, and the importance of understanding another person beyond their surface. Leela, on the other hand, was quietly adjusting to this new life, still unsure of what her future held. She had agreed to this marriage because she thought it would offer her a way out of the struggle she had known for so long. But now, with Richard acting so differently, she wasn't sure where things were headed. She hadn't expected to find respect or curiosity in his eyes. She hadn't expected him to care about who she really was. In her experience, people like Richard, the wealthy, powerful people, only saw what they wanted to see: a beggar, a person with no worth beyond what they could provide. But Richard had been different. He had listened. He had apologized. And somehow, she felt that maybe, just maybe, something real could come from this. The days passed, and Richard couldn't help but wonder if there was more to Leela than just the tragic story she had shared. He had spent his life avoiding the messy parts of life, the parts that weren't perfect, the parts that didn't fit into his neat world of polished luxury. But with Leela, he found himself drawn to her authenticity, her resilience, and the way she carried herself with quiet strength. One afternoon, after a long day of meetings and business calls, Richard came home to find Leela sitting in the living room, reading a book. She looked calm, focused, and at peace. It struck him how comfortable she had become in his world, how easily she had adapted to the strange new life she now found herself in. He had expected her to struggle, to resent this life, but she seemed to take it in stride. It made him realize how little he knew about her, how much he still needed to learn. He walked over to her, hesitating for a moment before sitting down beside her. Leela looked up from her book, giving him a small smile. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice gentle but sincere. Richard couldn't help but smile back, though it felt strange to be smiling at her in this way. He wasn't used to showing this side of himself. "Busy," he replied, his tone softening. "But I was thinking about what you said, about your past." Leela set the book down, her expression thoughtful. "I didn't expect you to really listen, but I'm glad you did." Richard leaned back in his chair, trying to collect his thoughts. "I've been thinking about what you said, about how people only see what they want to see. I realized I've spent my whole life doing that, only seeing what I want to see, judging people based on what they have, what they look like. And I've never really stopped to think about what's behind all of that." Leela nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "I know that feeling. It's easy to get caught up in appearances, to judge someone by what they show the world. But the truth is, no one really knows what another person has gone through unless they take the time to listen." Richard was quiet for a moment, feeling the weight of her words. He had lived in a bubble, a world of wealth and status, and had never stopped to understand what life was like for others. But now he was beginning to see things differently. The world wasn't just a place of surface-level achievements and appearances. It was full of people with stories, with experiences that shaped who they were. And Leela's story had opened his eyes to that. "I've been selfish," Richard admitted quietly. "I've always taken things for granted. But now, I'm starting to realize how much more there is to life. I want to understand more. I want to listen, really listen." Leela's smile was small but genuine. It's never too late to change, Richard. We both have a lot to learn. And maybe we can teach each other something along the way. The days that followed felt different from anything Richard had ever experienced. The mansion, which once seemed like a place of emptiness, filled with luxury, now felt more like a home. He and Leela spent more time together, talking about everything and anything. He found himself looking forward to their conversations, to the way she could make him see things in a new light. It was strange for him to be this open with anyone, especially someone who had come into his life under such unusual circumstances. But with Leela, it felt natural. Leela, too, was starting to feel more comfortable in this new life. At first, it had been hard to adjust. She had spent so many years on the streets, just getting by, that the idea of living in a place like Richard's mansion had been overwhelming. But as time passed, she began to see the beauty in the small things, the quiet mornings, the soft glow of the sunlight coming through the large windows, the peacefulness that filled the air. She realized that, in some ways, this life wasn't so different from what she had dreamed of when she was younger. The difference was, now she wasn't here for the money or the comfort. She was here because she wanted to be. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Richard turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "Leela, I've been thinking a lot about what you've said, about how we both need a fresh start." Leela looked up from the book she was reading, her eyes meeting his. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Richard continued, "I spent my life in this bubble, only caring about what's on the outside. I've never really taken the time to think about who I am, what I really want. And I think I've been running away from a lot of things." Leela put her book down, sensing the seriousness in his tone. She had noticed the subtle change in him, the way he was starting to reflect on his life, his choices. It wasn't easy for someone like Richard to admit his flaws, but she could see that he was trying to change. "I know what you mean," Leela said softly. "I've been running from my past for so long. I've carried it with me like a heavy weight, thinking I could never move past it. But I started to realize that running doesn't solve anything. Facing it, understanding it, that's the only way forward." Richard nodded, taking in her words. He had seen Leela's strength before, but now, as they shared these quiet moments, he was beginning to understand it in a deeper way. She wasn't just someone who had survived. She was someone who had learned to live with her past, to find peace with it. And in that, she had a wisdom he hadn't expected. I think we both have things to work through," Richard said, his voice thoughtful. "But maybe we can help each other. Maybe that's what this marriage really means." Leela smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I think you're right. We both have our stories, our struggles, but it doesn't mean we have to face them alone." The words felt like a promise. Richard had never expected that his life would take this turn, that he would find a kind of peace with someone who had come into his life so unexpectedly. But now, sitting beside Leela, he felt a sense of hope that had been missing for so long. It wasn't about the bed anymore. It wasn't about wealth or status. It was about two people, learning to understand each other, to grow together. That night, as they sat in the warmth of the living room, Richard and Leela both felt a sense of relief, a quiet understanding that things were changing. They weren't perfect, and they didn't have all the answers, but they had each other, and that was enough for now. In the days that followed, their connection deepened. They began to talk about their dreams. Lila's dream of one day helping others who had been through what she had, and Richard's dream of finding a purpose that went beyond just making money. They talked about the kind of people they wanted to be, and how they could support each other in becoming those people. It wasn't about fixing everything in one day. It was about taking small steps, side by side. The more Richard got to know Leela, the more he realized how much he had missed out on by living a life so focused on appearances and material success. Lila's ability to find meaning in the simplest things, her deep understanding of the world around her, was something he admired. She was teaching him what really mattered, in ways he hadn't expected. And Leela, in turn, was learning to trust again, to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could build a new life with someone who valued her for who she was, not for her past or her circumstances. They both knew there was still a long road ahead, but they were no longer walking it alone. Together, they had started something real, something neither of them had ever imagined at the start. And that, in itself, was a beginning. As time passed, the transformation in Richard and Leela's relationship was undeniable. What had begun as an unexpected marriage, based on a bet and surrounded by doubts, had evolved into something much deeper. They had learned to trust each other, to understand each other's pasts, and to build a foundation that was based on respect, patience, and a desire to grow together. Richard had never expected this. At the beginning, he had seen the marriage as a challenge, a way to prove something to his friends. But now he realized that he had gained far more than he could have ever anticipated. Lila wasn't just the woman he had married. She had become his companion, his confidant, and someone who had shown him what it meant to truly live with purpose. Leela, too, had changed. At first, she had entered the marriage thinking it was a way out, a way to escape her past. She had been unsure, even hesitant, about whether this life of wealth and luxury would really bring her happiness. But as she spent more time with Richard, she found herself opening up, not just to him, but to the world around her. She had always carried her past with her, unsure of how to let go of the pain, but now she realized that the pain didn't define her. What mattered was how she chose to move forward. And with Richard, she saw a path she had never imagined. One evening, as they sat together in the garden, Richard turned to her with a serious expression. "Leela, I've been thinking a lot about everything we've been through," he said. "We've both changed so much in such a short time." Leela looked at him, her eyes filled with understanding. "I know. It's like we've both shed the parts of ourselves that were holding us back." Richard nodded slowly. "I don't know if I ever would have realized this if it hadn't been for you. You've taught me so much about life, about what really matters. You've shown me that there's more to life than money and success. You've shown me the importance of truly living." Leela smiled, her heart warmed by his words. "You've taught me too, Richard. You've helped me see that it's okay to trust again, that I don't have to carry my past with me forever, and that I deserve more than just surviving. I deserve to live too." They sat there for a while in comfortable silence, watching the stars begin to twinkle in the sky. It was a peaceful moment, one that felt full of promise. Richard had never been one to believe in fate or destiny, but sitting there with Leela, he couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, their meeting hadn't been by chance. Perhaps this strange and unexpected marriage was the beginning of something greater for both of them. As the weeks went by, Richard and Leela continued to grow closer. They worked together on projects, attended social events as a couple, and slowly they began to blend their lives in ways that felt natural. Richard started to take more time for himself, focusing on what truly brought him joy and fulfillment. He began to invest in causes that were close to his heart, causes that helped people in need, just as Leela had once been. And Leela, too, began to find her own sense of purpose. She started volunteering at local shelters, helping those who were going through the same struggles she had faced. She realized that through her own pain, she had gained something valuable, the ability to help others who needed it most. Their marriage, once founded on a silly bet, had grown into a partnership based on genuine love and understanding. The past no longer seemed to define them. What mattered now was the life they were building together, one day at a time. As the months turned into years, Richard and Leela's bond grew even stronger. They had created a life that was full of meaning, a life that neither of them had imagined when they first met. And while they both knew there would still be challenges ahead, they faced those challenges together, with a shared sense of purpose and a love that had been tested and proven time and time again. In the end, they realized that what started as a simple bet had turned into something far more profound. It had taught them both the importance of looking beyond the surface, of seeing people for who they really were, and of understanding that true happiness came from within, not from material things. Together, they had built a life that was richer than anything money could buy, a life filled with love, purpose, and the knowledge that they had each other, no matter what the future held.